Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm Tara Crawford. I'm a second year PhD student here in the Higher Education Student Affairs program at The Ohio State University. I'm also a Qual Lab intern, and we're so excited to welcome you to our Spring 2026 Qual Lab lunch. Over the course of the next hour, I will share some brief housekeeping tips, and then after, we'll have some opening remarks from our director, Dr. Penny Pasquay. And then I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. E. Alexander. And then from there, they'll do their talk. And after their talk, we'll have an opportunity for a question and answer. And after question and answers, we'll share some more information about how you can stay connected with the Qual Lab and share some more information on our upcoming events. So thank you, thank you, thank you so much for joining us today. And just in terms of housekeeping, we are recording this session. We will have closed captioning on, and also you'll be able to access the recording on our website as well as our YouTube channel within 3 business days. And please feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat. Myself or Dr. Pasquay or our speaker will be happy to answer your questions during the question and answering session. So thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Pasquay for some opening remarks.
Your patience, and I'm so happy you're here. Welcome to the Qual Lab Lunch. Love this series. I really appreciate all that the presenters pour in. I'm excited about this one in particular because this is somebody who used to work with me on the Qual Lab as it started and was founded. But who we are a research center, and we work on training and advancing qualitative methodologies, really so that we can have quality, thoughtful, quote unquote, rigorous, maybe not, that might not be the right word for you. So whatever your right word is for that stellar, thoughtful, qualitative approach, this is the right place to be. And we have a dashboard of resources that we've kept up free, even though the college is no longer sponsoring us. It's all through grants and contracts, but we still left it up there so that you can see all the webinars, all the resources that we have, the links to NVivo and different, so please use those. We also host different events like the Qual Lab Lunches, Advanced Methods Institute, Unapologetic Educational Research, addressing anti-Blackness and racism in qualitative research. So those are all up there for you to see. And again, books and all the things, but welcome. On to the next slide. Ohio State, we often in the past with the Qual Lab Lunches have started with a land acknowledgement. Ohio State, the state of Ohio, has decided that land acknowledgements are considered statements or issues, and that we cannot do those if it is an Ohio State presentation like this one is. So what I decided to do is make sure that you see the land acknowledgement policy at Ohio State, and we take a moment just to reflect on that policy, why it was put in place, and then think about the important things that labor, land have done and contributed to qualitative over the years, and your position on what you think regarding the importance of labor and land and qualitative research. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that and make sure that you did know why we were proceeding without a land acknowledgement. That said, if you're in Ohio, I welcome you to come to the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. These are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites across the state that are Indigenous, amazing sites that have a wonderful history, and you can learn all about them. I hope you get a chance to come visit us and see this land in person. I wanted to start today because today is actually one of the first days of formal remembrance of Reverend Jesse Jackson. And one of the quotes for him in terms of Black History Month as well, I thought it was timely to talk about how time is neutral and does not change things. With courage and initiative, leaders change things. So as a qualitative research leader, what are the ways that you are engaging with the research to make concrete change that makes a difference in the lives of people, the land, humans, etc. So I appreciate that, thinking about researchers as leaders. With that, I think I'm turning it back to Tara.
Thank you, Dr. Pasquet, for your remarks. And I will have the pleasure of introducing our wonderful speaker today, E. Alexander, who will be giving a talk, as you can see on your screen, titled Following Rural Black Histories Through Emergent Study Design. E. Alexander is an assistant professor at the University of Kansas and especially an alum of the Qual Lab. Combining many of their field of study and centering Black diasporas, E's work is dedicated to anti-colonialism, transformative justice, healing, joy, and liberation. Their praxis has included campus organizing, community and campus development, policy advocacy, counseling, restorative justice, and research consulting. E now works with colleagues to expand both uses of qualitative methods and biopic knowledge systems in the allied health professions. E was raised by a large family of church members, educators, care workers, farmers, community and labor organizers, and creatives. They are working on way too many projects at one time, and their favorite is a multi-book series that explores the uses of art and creativity in social justice work. And with that, I invite us all to give a warm welcome and virtual round of applause to our speaker, E. Alexander, and I will pass it over to E to go through their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for my methodology talk on emergent study design. As is often the case for emergent studies, I consider this work to be part of what I hope will be a longer ongoing project. Today, I'm showing the initial steps that I've taken to support what I hope is to come. I'm also sharing some of the photo documentation I've been doing as a part of this project. You'll see that throughout the presentation, including this photo, so I hope you enjoy that. So to expand on Tara's introduction of me, and thank you, Tara, so much of my work aims to recognize the knowledge of Black elders and Black ancestors to examine how Black people bring them and their wisdom with us wherever we go. This is work that I've been doing for about a decade now, and I try to bring my family into my work however I can, and that's reflective of my own values. For example, I'm now working on pieces with my mother, my brother, and my uncle related to education and art. My work also includes discussions of trauma, healing, love, and the Black imagination. Finally, my research aims to center members of Black diasporas who are often erased, even in conversations among us as Black people about us as Black people. And this topic is part of that work with an explicit turn to rural Black folks. I come from rural families on both sides, and the region of focus today, which is Appalachia, is one of my familial homes. Although most Black Americans live in urban areas, because most people live in urban areas in the US, not all of us do. And those of us from rural areas have different challenges, different relationships to land and place, and different strengths on which we rely on a daily basis. These are often documented within the context of civil rights struggles, poor life outcomes, and forms of neocolonial violence. And that can make sense because we've gone through a lot and we're still going through a lot. But there are other ways to understand Black life and Black rural life, and I'm interested in exploring some of those. Today's focus is on West Virginia specifically, where Black people make up only 4% of the population. And I'm focusing here because coal brought Black people into West Virginia, which means that coal mining history is part of Black history. Black men have worked in the coal industry since the 1700s. Unsurprisingly, most of them at that time were enslaved, so it was forced labor and labor exploitation. And after emancipation, as Black people were moving up north and to the west looking for work, those who were looking to work in the coal industry, majority of them came to West Virginia because that is where most coal companies were concentrated based on where they were able to locate coal. These Black men were always hired into the lowest paid jobs as well as the most dangerous. And so they were disproportionately injured, disabled, killed, and poisoned while they were on the job. When companies hired them, they also were typically single and they lived in shanties in what was called coal camps. And so these were very bare bones places to live that didn't really have any amenities. And so the risk of getting sick and also dying was really high there as well. But as companies sought to expand their operations, they developed camps into full service towns to attract white miners and their families. They also built the towns to be racially segregated, and the hope was that the miners wouldn't come together and form bonds away from work. But they did that anyway, partially because the crews were integrated in the first place, and the other reason being that Black and white people moved freely about the towns, even though they were built to be segregated. And so miners and their families socialized and they built lives across race. They also built solidarity to challenge poor work conditions. And these bonds helped them to organize and form the United Mine Workers of America, which is one of the nation's oldest and most influential labor unions. However, the UMWA didn't do away entirely with racialized disparities in pay or in work injury and death, and definitely not with regards to job precarity more broadly for Black folks. Strains on the industry during the World Wars caused the companies to close early. Advances in technology also reduced the need for such big work crews. And then, of course, coal is a finite source. And so as the companies felt as though they were extracting all that they could from the earth, they began to shrink and then close. And unsurprisingly, it was Black men who were laid off first. So this caused a huge exodus of Black people out of West Virginia between the 1950s and the 1970s. And that left West Virginia's Black population around a steady 4%, which is about what it is now. And then West Virginia's coal mining workforce is about 3% Black. And yet, Black West Virginians experience social ills that include school dropouts, incarcerations, and lack of access to health care at a rate that's astronomical in comparison to that of white West Virginians. So coming into this project, again, it's an emergent project, I wanted to better understand the lived reality of Black West Virginians in relation to the socio-history that I just briefed. And this, again, was part of a larger project in which I'm hoping to learn more about the material realities of Black rural America. I felt like I needed to know more about both the history and social dynamics before delving into primary data collection, and that there was only so much that I could learn from afar as a scholar. Of note here, though, is that there was some light tension that I experienced as I was planning this project. I wanted to focus on Black life more broadly, and I was advised by some of my senior colleagues who are very well-meaning and care about me to focus on illuminating quality of life disparities in the direction of health outcomes. And the reason they wanted me to do this is because they were thinking longer term, and what they'd mentioned is that there would be more funding to support my work longer term with regards to health issues, as opposed to looking more broadly at everyday Black life. Thinking more about everyday Black life, maybe falling more within like a humanities area, which is not as well funded as research in health related areas. And of course, daily life and health outcomes are intertwined, but I was acutely aware of how often discourses about us as Black people immediately pathologize us, especially through clinical language that's used as a guise of objectivity while still pathologizing us. And I wanted to try to avoid this through opening the project to possibilities that I couldn't even see yet. And that is where emergent design is actually very helpful. So with emergent design, a scholar goes into an environment of inquiry and they organically explore it. The idea is that through interactions with the environment, study topics and data would naturally reveal themselves to the researcher. In theory, a true emergent study doesn't have conceptual frameworks that guide it. It doesn't have study aims, particular study aims, or even concrete plans for collecting and analyzing data. And sometimes it doesn't have a timeline. It's related to ethnography in that a researcher explores a field organically. And it's related to grounded theory in that the researcher will look for more topics to study based on what's being revealed to them while they're in the field. But that lack of structure can cause issues with IRBs because IRBs need to assess risk. So they need to know what a researcher is doing. And it can also cause issues in finding funding because most funders want to support research that is aligned with their specific mission. So if they don't know what a researcher is doing, they can't know whether that work is going to align with the mission. The other part of that is that I'm just a planner. There was no way I was going to go into the field not having any kind of plan. So I followed these recommendations for grounding my field work. The practices that are recommended by methodology scholars are in the left column, and in the right column are my applications of those practices. These practices can help to establish rigor. They work best when they're used together, and they're understood to be initial steps as part of a larger and more systematic research process that will be done later out of the field. Recommendations 4 through 6, they kind of explain themselves, but I'll talk about them briefly before I jump back and talk in more detail about recommendations 1 through 3. So one of the things that's recommended is taking pauses in the field while collecting data, just so the researcher can step back, clear their head, make sense of what's before them, and try to figure out what's happening next. I did this twice while I was in the field. And then there's recommendation number 5, which is doing analysis in an iterative fashion. I did this twice while I was, I did this daily while I was in the field. And I did it twice daily. So there was doing it in real time while I was collecting data, and then doing it at the end of each day once I got back to where I was staying. And now I'm doing it more systematically as I prepare to go back out into the field for round 2. And then the last recommendation, number 6, is pivoting a study if the researcher experiences or encounters a barrier. That didn't really happen for me up front because I'm a planner. I talked to many different people and consulted, and that includes consulting with my IRB to figure out what I could do without needing a protocol, because I wanted to try to interact with the environment as organically as possible. And part of the conversation we had is that sometimes going through an informed consent process can basically stop organic interactions in their tracks. And so I did ask them, what information can I record without needing to do that? And we talked about, what's considered to be public observation and at what level I needed to be vague in order not to identify anyone, and what things collectively I could write about or talk about without needing to go through an IRB process. So that did cause me to make some changes up front in my planning. But once I was out in the field, I didn't have any issues because I was so flexible in what it is that I was willing to do. Okay, so now I'll go back and look at practices 1 through 3. Recommendation 1 is framing an emergent study as being exploratory in support of a more systematic project to be done later. And this is how I framed the study when I was applying for funding to support it. As part of exploration, I used the following methods in the field, and I also include the approximate amounts of time that I dedicated to each one of those methods. I prepared for the possibility of using these methods, and then I picked the ones to use in response to what was happening in real time. In most cases, the conditions were simply more nuanced, and that made me feel as though I needed more methods to better understand what was happening in front of me and what I was experiencing. And then I want to circle back or go a little deeper just for a sec in looking at approach number 6, which is visiting sites of cultural and historical significance. In addition to understanding the history of Black people in coal mining, I wanted to more fully understand Black lives generally in West Virginia. So I planned to visit as many sites as possible that had been identified as being of cultural or historical significance for Black West Virginians. And these were places that people lived, worshiped, socialized, worked, or maybe just passed through looking for work. I organized the list here based on literature from the National Park Service. And then I hope to identify more locations once I was out in the field, and that was something that happened. Before traveling, I researched each location, I mapped them out, and then I began planning which stops I could reach in one trip. I ended up visiting 15 of those places, and I plan to visit the other 7 when I return. The second recommendation for adding structure is phasing a project so that it develops in layers. To think about this project in layers, I had to plan it narrow to broad, or that's how I thought about it. So starting with the smallest circle at the bottom, it's like a turquoise color, and then working my way out, my in-person data collection, which was more methodical and systematic, was part of my broader exploration process, which is the next circle up. That exploration, that in-person exploration, it included information gathering to inform data collection. And that was part of my preparation to do primary data collection later on. But that preparation also included other background research to support whatever exploration I was going to do in the field, and then whatever data collection I was going to do. So that included reading more, doing those consultations, for example, with IRB, meeting with people, getting advice. And then some of the universities in West Virginia do have digital archives, or they were able to digitize some of their materials. And so I could look at those as well before I came out into the field. Eventually, all of this is going to lead to primary data collection. And it all, and all of it fits under what I consider to be the first phase of this project. But then additionally, going back to the small circle, the turquoise circle, the in-person data collection is becoming its own project. And now it'll have its own phases because I plan to go back into the field and do more collection in these ways. And this is my loose analysis process, quote, loose analysis done every day in the field to help me with refining my focus between the stages of data collection. So every day when I went out, I had my audio recorder, my notepad, pencils, erasers, and my camera. And I was constantly recording notes, writing notes, taking photos, and then I reviewed all of that at the end of each day. I identified patterns, themes, and stories in the data. Given that my focus was Black stories and Black histories, I needed to look for stories and within them looking at themes. And I identified the ones that were the strongest. The strongest ones became my focal point for the next day's work, alongside any specific topics that I wanted to explore. And then finally, I kept notes on the side about meta narratives and discursive questions that I had that were developing as I was going through the field. And so this is what I did every day. This analysis is all considered preliminary, though, because it's something that I had to do in real time as opposed to, coming out of the field and having time to sit down with the data and look at it and then sit back from it and process and maybe take some time away from it and come back to it. That all is part of a more in-depth and methodical analysis that I'm doing now. So for that reason, this process, although it had many pieces, is still considered preliminary. But it allowed me to make sense of what I was witnessing in the studies and media context while being in West Virginia. It also helped me identify patterns in the data that were worth delving into further before I went out into the field again. And it allowed me to narrow and broaden my focus based on what I was learning. So overall, this is what my process looked like using emergent design. Again, emergent designs don't typically use theories or frameworks in relation to methods. However, several concepts inform how I thought about myself in the field as the study instrument being the person. This table includes some references to chapters in 4 different books. You can go and explore those if you're interested. So I'll give you just, maybe 15 seconds to look at those. So collectively, these sources helped me to think through how I was being a full person in relation to my values while being out in the field. And as a reminder, West Virginia is 4% Black. And I was a Black woman in my 30s, moving around the state, wearing joggers and hoodies and boots, and that's how I showed up. Before arriving in West Virginia, I had been in another part of Appalachia, and I was doing the same thing. I was interested in understanding the environment based not only on how people interacted with each other, but how they interacted with me as a hyper-visible person who I assumed that most people assumed was an outsider. This somewhat shifted the center of gravity for fieldwork as we think about it, because I'm the researcher going in and looking at, quote, the researched, but that's not really what I wanted, and I couldn't have that to some degree because I couldn't blend in, and that was okay. Because I wanted to get some inkling of how it felt to be a Black person in West Virginia. And I wanted my interactions to serve as a mirror to help me better understand my own reflexivity. In other words, standing out helped me to better understand both the social environment and whatever baggage I was bringing into the field. This also meant that I had to be mentally and emotionally ready to be perceived and engaged with as a hyper-visible outsider. But I would say that I was ready for that. And it's because of how I was raised, how I was trained as a practitioner, and where and how I practiced before even coming into academia. So what I include here is this table. These are aspects of who I am that I felt directly benefited me in interacting with people while I was there. What I quickly found was that who I was as a person actually aligned pretty well with the general vibe of the people in the place. And I think this is because I was raised by rural people. I was trained as a practitioner by rural people. And I've worked with rural people throughout my career. So in that way, it put me at home. Something else that I realized in real time is that although I've lived in many environments and I code switch and I love a well planned out city, I'm a country girl in how I relate to people. And that includes in making connections and understanding them and them understanding me. And my values and my personality are a reflection of, again, how I was raised and how I was trained, which is as a country girl. I mention this specifically for the students who are here. It's okay to know who you are as a person and to bring who you are and where you come from into your scholarship. Oftentimes, we're pressured in academia to leave who we are at the door. And I'm telling you, do not do that. It's okay to choose research methods as well that allow you to bring your full personhood into your research process. That's part of you shaping your scholarly identity. And I would wager that if you do that, you're also going to feel more embodied in whatever work you choose to do. So based on who I am, this is what I experienced. And here I also want to note that my broad observations alongside my background research helped to inform where I would put my attention when it was time to do data collection. So these things are connected. Again, interactions informing data collection. My most important observation was how intertwined West Virginia identities seem to be with its geography and its topography. These mountains are gorgeous. They're amazing. I love mountains. I love hiking. I've been to quite a few different ranges, and I can tell you that these are also very rugged. A person can live in them and be very secluded, wouldn't even know they were there. There are some places that looked as though no one lived there, but then I see some sign of life and I thought, oh, well, somebody's around somewhere. There were other places where people seemed to live right on the river. Travel could be hard and dangerous, especially if the weather is not great. And if a person gets lost and they don't know their way around and reception is bad, they're kind of out of luck for the time being. They have to, you have to find someone who can help you to figure out where to go. All of this shapes people in their relationship to place. And I can say that everywhere I went, people who, to me, they didn't seem like they were tourists. They had something on their person that identified them as being connected to the place. So I got the impression that there's a lot of pride in the relationship between the people and the mountains and the place. With me, people were friendly. They spoke to me like they were my family. We cracked jokes. They told me all kind of personal stories, and I just have those stories now. And this happened everywhere I went, and I almost never initiated it. And I would also say that in all but 2 interactions, race didn't really seem like it had any bearing on how non-Black people interacted with me. Black people interacted with me like we were related. And the other thing that I noticed and I really appreciated is that older people, regardless of their background, they felt that they had the right, and I would say that they do, they had the right to give me tips on how to do this project. And I like that because it aligns with my researcher identity of being responsible to community. The last thing that I really noticed is that people spoke about class, or they alluded to working class struggles constantly. They were open about expressing working class solidarity and also relying on each other to survive in daily life. And this became my point of reference for beginning my data collection and analysis. Okay. So to this point, I've walked you through why I'm doing this project, its process, my positionality, and my broad observations in the field. I'm now going to take you through an example of how I staged the collection and analysis process. And we're going to follow one of the stories that's about labor, class, and race. There were plenty of questions, though. Plenty of things that came up, but this is the one that I want to show you all. So I started off doing work in the southern part of West Virginia. So I started south and worked my way north through the state. My first stage was visiting the first archive that I went to, and also the first set of historical sites. What I wanted to really understand was there this post-racial, what were things really post-racial? And we can talk about what that means, of course, and problematize that as we should. But just given my experiences combined with the literature that informed me coming out, I wanted to know if there was an attempt to erase Blackness or anti-Blackness in the region, because I was trying to square, would seem like solidarity and collectivism, regardless of race, with these racialized disparities in life outcomes. And so here's what I found. So the stories that were emerging were about worker rights and Black life, but they almost never overlapped. And again, this is just the first stage, so it wasn't as big of a deal that things weren't overlapping. I did find it interesting, though, just given that historically majority of coal miners were Black because they were enslaved. But coal mining and Black life were talked about separately. With regards to mining, themes were really around terrible work conditions and terrible bosses, and the need to advocate for worker rights, but it was done while not acknowledging race. And then with regards to data about Black people, they really fell into two different categories. There was the data that was created by Black people so that they could write themselves into the history. And there was the data that was created by the state government, which focused more on social problems. And I found this to be interesting because it felt like that same dichotomy, false dichotomy that I had experienced in trying to figure out how to design this project and what the focus should be. Should I focus on Black life and that falling more in humanities, or should I focus on social issues and that falling more within health research? Again, these are false dichotomies, but I did notice that, in order for there to be a full representation of Black personhood in the data, Black people had to create that data. The other thing I noticed is that there seemed to be an attempt to absorb Black labor issues into larger working class issues, which essentially would be rendering Blackness invisible as a part of work discourse. Women also started to come up, framed immediately as caretakers to coal miners in these company towns. And so given the erasure, seemingly, in these working class discourses, and given Black scholarship's more holistic focus away from work, I felt like I needed to better understand whether race or class, quote, came first in issues of labor in the mines as it was presented in the data. Not saying that I don't understand intersectionality, I definitely do, but how is it being presented in data? Okay. So this was the question I wanted to answer when I went into the next part of data collection. The data was collected at a museum, which housed its own archives and artifacts, and also through a public oral history, as well as through casual conversation that I had with one of my informants that ended up being structured like an oral history. And here's what came through. The story was that regardless of the miner's background, based on what the data was revealing, all workers were treated terribly. They were treated as expendable by their bosses. In fact, mules literally had more monetary value than people because people could be replaced more easily than mules could be. Companies stole wages from workers. They paid them in script and then hiked up the prices of things in company stores where miners could only pay for things in script. And of course, there was a lot of attempting to do union busting. And through all of the narratives that were coming out in the sources, it seemed as though there was so much need to focus on the rights of miners and keeping each other safe and keeping each other alive that they didn't have time to get into any kind of tussles over racial issues. The explicit themes are around worker solidarity, class consciousness, and distrusting bosses. Then there were implicit themes about the roles of Black people and women in worker struggles. And then sexism also started to come up. And then the patterns were just speaking negatively about companies and speaking fondly about one's crew. And these were some of the questions that I started to develop based on my process and keeping my notes on the side for things to look into later. I was curious to know who was telling the story and who wasn't. And through that, who was and wasn't telling the story, what was being emphasized, disregarded, and even discarded. And I also wanted to know whether Black people had a choice in including their stories as part of the, quote, main narrative. What I also noticed here is that where there was discussion of Black people and women, it was in the background in terms of contributions or the role played in worker right movements. Race and gender only came up in literature around the museum and its archives, whereas data about working conditions were more explicitly discussed and more explicitly placed spatially front and center, so they were easy to find. So I had to poke and prod and really walk around, which is what I'm supposed to be doing as a researcher, but I'm just making the point that I had to dig a little more to find those things, as opposed to this, larger conversation or narrative around worker rights being something that was easily accessible. Collectively, the data sources at this step turn their gaze towards companies, labor practices, and state policies. In other words, they were making the conversation a macro level one about class and sidelining individual stories about race and gender. And this, of course, was frustrating for me given where I started with this process, but it was still illuminating with regards to discourses around class. So at this point, I started to wonder, are coal miners leftists? And we're just not talking about it because it would complicate political discourses about Appalachia. That was kind of what I was left with, So then going into the next part, the next stage of data collection, I went to my second museum and my second archive, and those were in the central part of the state. Leaving the southern part of the state, what I was picking up on is that the data seemed to be highlighting class, again, sidelining race, and also focusing more on broader discourses about West Virginia. And so I was curious to know, if I zoomed out, what were the state, regional, national, and federal level conversations about race and labor in relation to exploitation in the mines? And here's what I found. Broader discourses really celebrated how much West Virginia has given to advancing the U.S. through its people, its natural resources, and its advocacy efforts. The themes highlighted how members of oppressed groups grew to distrust politicians as well as employers. So at this point, there's this growing sentiment of discontent with all power holders, how they came together to educate themselves about social justice, and how they also came together to self-advocate. The data continued to focus on class issues with nods to race and gender throughout museum exhibits and through presenting data about race and gender in their own documents. This was concerning for me because it felt as though conversations about the contributions of Black people, women, and at this point, immigrants was being treated as its own little side narrative rather than being part of the large, quote, main narrative. But on the upside, race and gender were discussed more in depth through, their own places and exhibits and through the collections that I looked at. Notably, though, many of the accounts in the collections were memoirs or surveys, which means that once again, people had to write themselves into the history of coal and class struggles. And in the deepening of class conversations, issues of health, affordability, child labor, and unemployment protection started to come up. And I also include some examples here of ways that immigrants, Black people, and women receive those quick nods or those acknowledgments for having roles in the coal industry, as well as in larger class struggles. So through looking at the archives and the museum, and included in the archives and museum was also a library, I felt that I was able to solidify several assertions. Life was hard in the mines and it was dangerous. Miners were treated very terribly, no matter who they were. But the third thing that was also coming up was that Black people and women, as well as immigrants, were part of all of these events in West Virginia history, but most often they weren't being specified for their contributions. Okay. So then I moved on to the third archive and the third museum, and this was in the northern part of the state. I wanted to know if there were any larger puzzle pieces that would help me to understand the role of Black people in the coal industry, especially with the rise in social justice advocacy that was happening at the same time as these labor rights struggles. And here's what I found. Because West Virginia's trade industries were pivotal in developing the rest of the country, it seemed as though the federal government wanted to better regulate them at some point, and regulations included improving safety standards, which then required educating workforces about safety standards and safety practices in the workplace. State politicians recognized the longstanding role of Black men in the coal industry and thus their longstanding role in building U.S. infrastructure, unsurprisingly consistent with the rest of what we know about the history of us in this country. But politicians also recognized that Black men didn't have access to education in the state's universities because they weren't allowed to. And so union leaders, politicians, and university faculty came together to develop extension programs in STEM disciplines to educate Black men and boys. Other groups, of course, also benefited from these extension programs. They were included. This included, even poorer white folks and those who lived in the most secluded parts of the state. But the archive suggested that a lot of time was given to highlighting the role of race and racialized work issues in relation to developing these extension programs. So, notably, the archives discuss educating Black men and boys as being a benefit to the industry and government, but not necessarily being a benefit to the Black workers themselves or their families or their communities. These documents illustrate the recognition of Black men's contributions to the coal industry, as well as their needs in further education and professionalization in whatever their field was. This is also the first time that I saw Black women being acknowledged as working in the mines. I also took some photos of manuals that were sent to Black men in their homes and communities to do self-education. These manuals were very thick, and there were a lot of them because they covered different parts of doing one's job. And there are many of them in the archives. This education that Black men were doing for themselves was then paired with periodic in-field training and mentorship through the extension offices. So this seemed to be with a master skills person or someone who was part of faculty. And I include photos on the right side of the top right, Black boys receiving training, and then in the bottom right, Black men receiving training as well. So that's an example of how I used the steps that I briefed as part of my preliminary loose analysis while I was collecting data in the field. And so to wrap up, I'll brief what I learned and what's happening now. I came out of the field process having discovered information and data related to 2 of my 3 topics of interest. I didn't learn anything new about topic number 2 that I didn't already know from doing background research. So when I go back out, I'm going to prioritize learning about that. Learning about that this summer. In response to everything I learned, I also developed these possible research questions for the future. This illustrates me coming to understand my topic of interest as being more nuanced than I originally anticipated. And because this is an emergent study, I didn't really anticipate anything in particular. I just went in ready to do work and to interact with people and to be open with whatever came to me. So I'll give you all maybe about 15 seconds to read through these questions. Other stories, obviously, emerged during this process as well. And again, I had to prioritize what to pursue in this first round of field work. So here are the stories, and they're listed in the priority order that I'd listed them when I was doing analysis in the field. And I'll decide which ones to further explore in round 2 based on my conversations with community members and maybe also what I find when I go back out to do data collection. But I really want feedback from the community to be at the center of what I choose to explore. And here's where I am now. In consultation with community members, I'm starting to analyze and explore my data in a more systematic way. I'm starting to outline possible conceptual manuscripts coming out of this process. I'm making connections with scholars, practitioners, and creatives who do work related to West Virginia or Appalachia. I'm also connecting with some folks who are part of the United Mine Workers of America. And again, I'm doing my prep work in relation to going back out. So that includes sharing my findings back to community members and receiving feedback from them that is, not just constructive, but also corrective. If there's anything that they say, you got that wrong, then I need to receive that feedback. And then I also want to receive directives from them on how I should move forward in a way that's going to actually be beneficial to them, in support of them having whatever it is that they would like to have as Black people living in West Virginia, being a very small part of the population, and also, experiencing what they're experiencing with regards to quality of life. That is for them to tell me and for me to receive and use as I think about moving forward. And then the last thing is just doing more field exploration and data collection. I fully recognize the fact that I could not have discovered everything everywhere, especially not in one trip. That is not how field work works and not how archival work works. And so I do plan to go back out and revisit places, go to the sites I wasn't able to visit before, and then delve deeper into the archives in each one of those settings that I visited. So I will pause here and see if anyone has any questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Eve, for that rich context. We do have a few questions in the chat, and so I will read them and then we will go from there. So the first question that I'll ask, someone anonymous raised this question. What did this experience teach you about studying rural communities?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing that I learned is the importance of being an authentic person. What I appreciated, again, and I come from rural backgrounds, but it's different being a person, just being a daughter or granddaughter, great granddaughter, being in a space. But it's the importance of actually being oneself, truly oneself, and using that in a way to connect to people. It has been my experience in academia that oftentimes we are told that in order to do good work and to do work that is considered trustworthy or, Penny problematized this term, but rigorous, that we have to remove who we are. And I actually find that it's much more important to be fully be who you are. And so that it, because this was exploratory, and again, I have not yet gone through an IRB process. Some might say that what it looks like for me to share who I am with people out in community looks different as compared to once I have my protocol in place. But it mattered that I was able to joke with people. It mattered that they shared stories and I was able to share some back. It mattered that people would ask me, okay, are you from here? No. Or what are you doing here? How do you know about here? Oh, your family's from here? Who are your family? Like, all of that mattered. And so it's really important to bring one's full self into the process of doing real research, because connections matter and relationships matter.
Thank you so much for that. Well, as a follow-up to that, how do you do that in academia where there is a lot of bureaucracy, and sometimes in order to advance, especially as an early career scholar, you might be in a position where you have to, in a sense, navigate through the bureaucracy and play through that. So how do you do that?
Well, I mean, yeah, this is obviously a subjective response on my part, but I think that's okay. Something that I've had, and this is, I promise, all this is connected, so stay with me here, but something that I've benefited from in my career, again, that's before coming into academia and then being a part of it, is living in many different types of environments. And what I notice is that the idea of bureaucracy and protocol varies depending on the environment. And so, as an example, I got support from my unit to do this work. That includes them literally just uplifting the work and also funding it. Possibly because I am in Kansas and it is rural, and there's an understanding that relationship building looks different in rural areas. And, as compared to having gone to school and worked in urban areas where there seems to be much more emphasis on an idea of, well, you call it bureaucracy, but I feel as though there are particular values that keep people from being authentic because there's pressure to perform professionalism in a particular way. And that pressure then creates more systems and structures and rules and what have you. The intention, supposedly, is to protect participants. and keep them safe, and thinking about IRB protocols and all of that. And I am here to let you know that that is conceptualized differently, or it has been based on where I've worked and where I've studied. So I do think part of it is, work like this calls on academia broadly to interrogate what its goals actually are, because if that bureaucracy is creating barriers to relationship building, which then creates barriers to doing good research, then again, I come back to who is that really for?
Thank you. Thank you. I think that brings us to our final question, and that is, and with your response there, building off of that is a great segue into the final question. A finding that you had elevated was about mining without race. That is extremely powerful. Did the emergent design that you enacted help you come up with the important findings, or were there other ways that the designs that may not have, if that makes sense?
Well, I think that where it was helpful was allowing me to be led by what was being revealed in the field. And one of the things that I mentioned for the concepts that guided me is understanding my own reflexivity. So when I came in, I didn't know what I was going to find. I am a person who is related to this region. I spent part of my life in this region as a child. It's where, my family's from. And so part of my personality is informed by that. But being a Black person just going in on my own, and again, I was deliberate in showing up authentically, including hoodies and knowing that there are particular discourses about Black people and what we wear and how we're perceived. I didn't know, is this going to make people push me away? Am I going to place myself in danger? I didn't know what I was going to receive. And I feel as though my point of staying true to how I wanted to show up actually was better in helping me to learn what I wanted to learn. If I had shown up, for example, I don't know, dressed business casual or something like that, I was going to be received differently. And that also means that people may or may not have shared what they did. They may or may not have been comfortable to talk to me in the ways that they did. I think that I was perceived as, although they knew that I was not fully from there, it was, but you're cool, right? Like you're coming in, you don't seem like you're trying to be better than anybody else. You're laughing with us, you're joking with us, you're sharing about yourself. So I actually do think that the emergent design supported me in being able to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. And in terms of, race related to mining, where that was helpful was being able to triangulate's not the right word, but being able to compare what I was seeing in the archives to what I was comparing out in community. And they ended up being consistent. And I do question, had I used a different approach, what I would have seen.
Thank you. Thank you. And I did say we had one more question, but we actually have one final question. I want to make sure that we answer this and address this question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, E. We have a comment and it says, amazing work. I cannot wait to read more and engage with it in my own work. I'm curious about the community aspect of the research. I believe in the premise, but wonder about when analysis might be in tension with what the researcher sees and what the community says happened. I can see ways where participants may not name racism, for example, or sexism, homophobia, etc. How do you navigate or approach this tension?
And is from faculty here in the College of EET, Dr. Denora Sanchez Loza. So,
Thank you. And I think I'm understanding the question because it's a little bit longer. So I was trying to make sure I followed. I think I followed. I think about my role in this project as being one. I'm the role of the researcher. I'm part of a team or part of a community. So as an example, as I am doing the analysis, I am talking to people out in community and saying, this is kind of what I'm seeing. Like, what do you think about that? And again, I have to open myself up to constructive and corrective feedback. And importantly, the folks with whom I am communicating out in community, they come from many different backgrounds. And so they're all giving me different perspectives. As an example, in talking to one person, they identify me as being an outsider who has ties. Other people identified me as someone who belongs to community, but I've been away for a while. So everyone's going to have a different perspective, even that as an illustration of different perspectives on what I'm finding. Using that then to go back and talk with different people to figure out, am I on the right track? Am I not on the right track? What else do I need to consider? What else am I not seeing? Where else should I go and who else should I talk to? To me, all of that has to be a part of the process, which is why this is an iterative process. Yeah. And I think the other thing that's important to highlight is because I'm focusing on Black history and Black stories, I do intend to prioritize members of the community who are Black, but I think it's important to talk to people from all different backgrounds because of the dynamics that I experienced. And that was that on the surface, everybody's in this together. So that means that, there could be situations in which I'm talking to a group of Black folks, and they may even refer me to some of their friends who are not Black. And I think that in itself is also important for considering whose voice is going to matter while still centering Blackness, because that's the focus for me.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly rich, and I would just appreciate you taking time to do the presentation and especially answer these questions. And with the most recent question, that was a very fluid response. And so personally, I appreciate you sharing that, and would ask for everyone in attendance to give a virtual, again, round of applause for our speaker for such a meaningful and timely presentation. Thank you so much, E. We
Thank you
truly
all for joining us.
appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
With that being said, we just have a few more context to share, and then we'll wrap up. We do again want to acknowledge E. Alexander for their time, and we also want to elevate the fact that they are an alum of the Qual Lab Research Center and have contributed to the book Advancing Culturally Responsive Research and Researchers, Qualitative, Quantitative, and Mixed Methods. And so if you are out there looking for more resources, we encourage you to take advantage of these resources. Also, we will be having another Qual Lab lunch on April 2nd from noon to 1 p.m. with Dr. View Johnson, who will be doing a talk entitled Curriculum of the Mind based on his dissertation. And I won't read the words verbatim to you on screen, but we are super excited about that, just as we are excited to have E. Alexander today. And we encourage you to stay connected with us on social media and with our newsletter for more information on how you can register for that presentation. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time today. Stay connected with us, and we hope to see you very, very soon.